Give me liberty, or give me death. Those words made me famous. But they were given for a cause, the cause of freedom, liberty. I've given my life to establish liberty for our nation. I was born in Virginia. I grew up as a typical young man. I loved to hunt and fish. I loved to spend time in the woods. Some men thought that I was an idler, wasting my time in play. But even apart from supplying the needs for my family, I was meditating, thinking about what I'd learned. I went to school, the common school, until I was 10. Then after that, I was tutored at home by my father, my uncle, who was a minister. I learned what all the boys of my age learned: Greek, Latin, history, geography, mathematics, the catechism. When I was a young man, my father decided it was time for me to go into business for myself, so he helped establish a store for me. I have to admit, I was not much of a businessman. But I did spend much time as customers would come into the store and they would talk among themselves. I normally didn't say very much. I would listen. You can learn more from listening than you can from talking. And so I would listen and learn from what they were saying. I would study the individuals to learn about men. In life, you need to be able to learn to discern a man's character. And often it takes only a very short time if you have eyes to see the way they talk, the way they hold themselves. You can tell if a man is proud or humble. Often you can tell if a man is honest or dishonest just by careful observation. I loved to hear their conversation. Sometimes if the conversation was lagging, I would bring up a topic just to stir up debate. I knew there was some topic that there would be controversy about, so I'd bring it up and start the debate and then sit back and listen to hear their arguments. My father and his brother, my uncle, were part of the Anglican Church, what may be known now as the Episcopalian Church. But when I was 12, a Presbyterian minister came to the area, and so my mother took me to hear him, Reverend Samuel Davies. Not only was he a great theologian, but he was also an eloquent speaker. And I would listen to try to learn his style. He was a very powerful and persuasive speaker. And on the way home, my mother would ask me questions about the sermon, make sure I was listening, which I always was. But we would discuss and have discussions about the sermon on the way home. Now, it is one thing that, even at that young age, influenced my thinking from that point on, even till now. My father is an Anglican. My mother's a Presbyterian. I never joined the Presbyterian church, though my mother did. But I saw the benefit of having different denominations, to have tolerance with one another. In Virginia at that time, the Anglican denomination was the official church of the state, or of the colony at that point. The Anglican church got special privileges. Okay, the ministers were paid by tax money. In some places, those who were not Anglican, who were called dissenters, faced very harsh treatment, but I'll come back to that. So I had my store, but unfortunately, within about a year, I went out of business. But in the meantime, I fell in love with Sally. And the two of us were married, even though I was only 18 and she was only 16. Her parents had to get permission because she was underage. And they were somewhat reluctant. Her father thought that I was not a very profitable style of husband for his daughter. But he consented anyway, and I'm glad he did. So we were married, and I took up farming. I'd grown up in there where we had a small farm, as my father was a surveyor, but we had a large garden. And so I started plowing and doing all the things that farmers do. Unfortunately, that summer, there was a drought. So most of my crops died. And the ones that did survive were taken by a frost. There was an early frost that year. So I lost the farm. So my father's invested in another business, another store, a tavern. But again, within a short time, it folded. It didn't look good. 3 attempts at business, 3 failures. But I asked the Lord to show me. I took inventory of my gifts. And I believed that law would be an area where I could succeed. And so I studied law. Now, there are 2 ways a man could be a lawyer as I was growing up in those years. One was to go to law school, such as College of William and Mary, where many distinguished my colleagues went. The other was to study on his own, and that's what I chose. But then to be admitted to the bar, to be allowed to practice law, I had to pass an examination by a panel of practicing lawyers. The ones that I had to speak with, I spoke to them individually, were very illustrious leaders of the colony. And one of them, Mr. Pendleton, when he saw me, I had just plain dress. I did not have fancy dresses. Most lawyers were dressed. He almost didn't even want to hear me because he thought that a man dressed so plainly couldn't know anything about law. But as we continued the discussion, he found that I did know a few things. I was a little vague on some of the fine points, but he realized I understood about natural law. There are laws given by God, and that human laws have to agree with what God's law says. So I was admitted to the bar. I was able to practice law. And so I was actually able to make a living, which was very helpful for my wife and our growing family. And then there was a case that came before the court, and it had to do with the way that ministers, the Anglican Church ministers, were paid. In Virginia, tobacco was the main crop, so the ministers were paid in tobacco, normally. But 2 years, the tobacco crop was very, very weak. And so a law was passed saying that instead of being paid in pounds of tobacco, they could be paid in money at 2 cents a pound, or what would have been a pound. Which means that the priest, the Anglican priest, didn't make as much money as they had in other times. And so they sued to get more money. Now, they won their case in court, but when it came time to pay damages, I was asked to help with the defense. And as the time came for the trial, my father, at that point, was the presiding judge. There was a panel of judges. And my uncle, the Anglican priest, was going to come. And I saw him outside, and I said, "Uncle, I don't want to hurt your feelings. I don't want you to be hurt by what I'm going to say, because I'm not going to be very nice about the clergy. I'd rather you just go home." And so he did. And so in the trial, I brought up the fact that these priests, these men who are supposed to represent God, were supposed to be examples to the rest of us about following the law. And yet here they were, they didn't want to obey the law. They were being greedy and selfish. They didn't deserve extra money. They didn't deserve anything. And the jury heard my case, and they agreed. Now, they had to pay a penalty, and the penalty they were requesting was 144 pounds, which is quite a bit of money. But after my arguments, they paid 1 penny of damages. And the case caused quite a stir all throughout the colony. It frankly helped increase my business as a lawyer. So I was thankful for that. The case is known as Parson's Cause. A parson is a minister. Not long after that, the British government started to impose a tax on stamps, what they called stamps. Any kind of document had to have a stamp, and you had to pay a tax to get that stamp. Now, we were colonists in America. The group that passed that law was Parliament in England. England had no jurisdiction. We had a charter from the king for our government in Virginia. So the law that they passed over there shouldn't have any effect on us. It was an unjust law. Okay? It's a basic principle of civil rights that the organization, the group that passes a law, especially a tax, should be from the area that's going to be taxed. They should be subject to the same tax. Okay? The members of Parliament in England, they weren't being affected by this Stamp Act. And so we protested. I was elected to the House of Burgesses, the legislature in Virginia. And after I'd only been there a few days, I presented some resolutions. Now, normally, in the normal course of business in those days, it was just those who had been there, the distinguished statesmen who had been there for years, who did all the talking and all the presenting. But I didn't care about tradition. I didn't care about decorum. This was wrong. What England was doing was wrong, and it had to be addressed. So I presented the Stamp Act resolve saying that the British Parliament had no jurisdiction over us. And it caused quite a stir in the legislature, but it passed. And that idea spread all through the colonies, that the British government had no jurisdiction over us. Not long after that, it became apparent that the colonies were going to have to do something. The British government continued to tax and to make laws that were affecting us that were unjust. And so members from all the different colonies got together in what was called the Continental Congress, where we just tried to discuss what we were going to do to present our case to England. And I knew at that time that we could no longer be joined to England. We must be independent. We couldn't allow them to rule over us anymore. But most of the men at the Congress, they wanted to try to work out, let's give it a little more time. Let's try this appeal. Let's do this. We'd already tried all those things. There was another man there, John Adams from Massachusetts. And during the convention, we got together, we discussed, and both of us realized, we knew together that there was no hope. We could not be reconciled with England. We had to be independent. But the rest of the Congress wasn't ready for that yet. Back in Virginia, it became apparent that things were getting worse. The governor of Virginia was appointed by the king, and he sent home the legislature because he thought we were getting too freedom-minded. But we knew we had to meet. We had important business. We had to take care of the people of the colony. The governor wanted to please the king, but we knew that we had an obligation to the people of the colony. And as the situation was getting worse, I realized there might come a time that we would have to fight for our independence, when the time for words and compromise would be over. So I proposed a resolution. We weren't meeting in Williamsburg, where the capital was, because the governor had sent us away. So we met in Richmond, at St. John's Church, which is the only building in this town that was large enough to hold us all. So I proposed a resolution that the colony organize itself into militias. Each community would have a militia. Men who were organized to fight. They would be trained, they would be equipped to fight if necessary. Now, these established members of the legislature, they protested. They said, well, we need more time. Let us try this appeal. Let us try that appeal. I'm sure it will work if we just have more time. And besides, we can't fight England. England is the most powerful nation in the world. Oh, what chance do we have against that? So they made their arguments against my resolutions. So then I stood up and said, in as many words, the time for discussion is over. The time for compromise has passed. There's only one way that we can be free, that we can have our liberty, and that's to fight. So I gave an impassioned speech, and I ended it this way. I said, they tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to meet so formidable a foe. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week or the next year? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our back and hugging the elusive phantom of hope until our enemy shall have us bound hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak. We make a proper use of those means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. 3 millions of people, armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as we possess, are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, who shall raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the active, the vigilant, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. Were we base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. War is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir. Let it come. It is vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What does the gentleman wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Well, my argument moved the legislature and the resolution was passed. And just as I had predicted, within a month, news came of the battle at Lexington and Concord. Virginia developed a resolution declaring that Virginia was independent of England. We wrote a new constitution for ourselves because we were no longer a colony of England. I was elected. In the meantime, okay, the former governor, actually just prior to that, the former governor, or the British governor, realized there was going to be some disturbance. And so the colony had what's called a magazine where the arms were stored in Williamsburg. And there's a large amount of gunpowder, and he took the gunpowder away, put it on a ship. Well, I knew that was wrong. Okay. That belonged to the colony, it didn't belong to England. And so I organized some men, with about 150 men. I started a march towards Williamsburg. And as we were marching along, other men joined, and other men joined. The farther we went, the more men joined it. By the time we got to Williamsburg, there were 5,000 men. When the governor saw that we were serious about it, okay, he didn't return the gunpowder, but he did make a payment for the value of the gunpowder. And after Virginia wrote its new constitution, okay, I was appointed commander of the 1st Regiment of the militia and commander of all the forces of Virginia. But unfortunately, there were other men who were over other regiments who didn't comply with the orders. and in effect went around my authority. And I became very frustrated and finally resigned. If I was going to be commander-in-chief, I needed to be commander-in-chief. Well, as much as that was a frustration to me, it was God's providence. Because I was elected governor of Virginia. So during the war, I did all I could to supply our troops. I went to recruit soldiers. I went to groups and to individuals to help raise supplies for our army. In fact, during that terrible winter at Valley Forge, when so many of General Washington's army were starving and freezing because they had ragged clothes or hardly any clothes, and no blankets, no real shelter, inadequate food, General Washington personally thanked me because I did all I could to supply them. I sent clothes, more clothes than the men for Virginia needed. I rounded up thousands of head of cattle and sent them so the men would have food and have leather for shoes. General Washington personally thanked me for my efforts. But the war wasn't all that was going on. I had to take care of the whole state. Now, in those days, Virginia, its western border went past the mountains to the Mississippi River, and then far upward north. And so one thing I wanted to do was explore that territory, so I sent George Rogers Clark on an expedition was in the Northwest Territory. And it was a very successful expedition. He learned a great deal. I think he has potential to be a great explorer. Well, after the war, I was elected 3 terms as governor during the war. After the war, I tried to step back a little bit from position. My first wife had died, and I was remarried. My health was bad because working literally night and day, my body was worn out. The new federal government, or the Articles of Confederation, what was running the country at that point. It was obvious that it needed some help because the central government didn't have enough power. Okay? Each state had its own powers, and there's very limited power with the government, the central government. And so a convention was called where men from each state came to try to revise the Articles of Confederation. But what they did instead was write a whole new constitution. Now, this shocked me because that wasn't what they were sent for. They were sent to make modifications to the Articles of Confederation, not write a totally new constitution. They had exceeded their authority, in my opinion. And then as I looked at the Constitution, as I read it, what was proposed, I was shocked. It would create a strong central government and taking the power from the states. I was very concerned because the states came before the central government. The states should retain the power. Okay, it had a standing army. We had raised an army to fight England, but I knew from experience, I knew from my studies of history, that if a government has an army, a full-time army, that it can use that army against its own citizens. That's happened over and over again through history. And there were no guarantees of rights of individuals. Now, people will say, well, those rights were assumed. Well, when it comes to government, we can't assume anything. The nature of government is to expand. The nature of government is to get bigger and to get more power to itself. Men who are in positions of power generally love positions of power and try to get more. So I was very disturbed. Now, this proposed constitution had to be ratified by the states. Each of the states had to have a convention to see whether they would accept it or not. And so when Virginia had its convention, I led those who were opposed to the Constitution. Now, I was facing such men as George Washington, James Madison, very illustrious, distinguished men whom I admire greatly. But they were wrong on this point. So I argued. I said, we cannot have this. We cannot have this. It looks simple. It looks harmless as it is. Okay. The idea was that the best men would be elected to the positions of government. Well, that may work now. Okay, it was generally accepted if this did pass that General Washington would become the president. I had no problem with General Washington becoming president. He's a great man. One of the finest men I know, a man of upstanding character, of godly leadership. But what about 2 generations from now? How do I know we're going to have another George Washington? How do I know we're going to have other men like James Madison, or George Mason, or John Adams to take the leadership? What if men were to become corrupt in those succeeding generations? Then our government will become corrupt. Then the government could use its power, which wasn't limited adequately, to get more power and more power. So finally, we'd become slaves. We had just fought a war to escape the oppression of the British government. And in my opinion, we were establishing a government that in a few generations could be worse than what we just escaped. Well, I argued all that I could. Mr. Madison and General Washington and their side prevailed. The Constitution was ratified in Virginia. It was ratified by the other states and took effect. I was offered several positions in the new government, but I couldn't be a part of it. I couldn't bring myself to be a part of what I thought would destroy the nation. But there was one good thing. Because of the arguments of myself and others in the Virginia Convention and in the New York Convention and others, other men who were concerned as I was about the power of the government, it was agreed that at the first session of Congress, there would be proposed a Bill of Rights, amendments to the Constitution, additions to the Constitution to change it, to guarantee some of the rights I was concerned about. Like the right of free speech. There was nothing in the Constitution to guarantee the right of free speech. In most countries of the world, if a man speaks against the king or the ruler of the government official, he'd be thrown in jail. He could lose his life because he dared to disagree with the government. There was a guaranteed freedom of religion. As I mentioned earlier, growing up with different denominations, I could see that there was something to be had, something to be gained by having a multitude of denominations. Okay, in my early practice, many of my cases were defending dissenting preachers. Okay? Many of the Baptists in Virginia at that time had ended up in jail, and so I had to fight to free them. Okay? Baptists and Presbyterians and others who are not of the Anglican persuasion. So to have a freedom of religion guaranteed was essential. Freedom of the press. The press is to be the watchdog over the government. Now, ultimately, the people are to be the watchdog over the government. But the press is to aid in that. If the press just goes along with what the government says, if no one is there to disagree with the government and to point out places in the government that is wrong, again, the government can just run roughshod over all of us. There were other guarantees. Trial by jury. Now, it was part of English common law by this point. They would say, of course we have a trial by jury. It's not just one judge who decides you die or not. He decides you go to jail or not, based on his own opinions. It had to be a trial by jury, okay, where there was a group of men, a group of peers of my fellow citizens, and they were to decide whether the arguments against me were sufficient to put me in jail or not. We can't depend on the whims of one man for our security. So all these guarantees were in the Constitution. And the best one, in my opinion, is what became the 10th Amendment, where it says specifically that the powers not given to the central government are to be retained by the state, they're to be kept by the state. Excuse me. Okay, because there are certain powers that are given to the central government, and they're listed. So the 10th Amendment says that any power not given to the central government belongs to the states and to the people. So I was relatively content with that, although still not enough to take positions in the government. I was even asked to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which I declined. So let me give you a charge. My time on earth is passing. I have fought for liberty in my generation. But you must fight for liberty in your generation. You are to be the watchdogs over the government. And you may say, but I'm just a young person. What can I do? You can keep abreast of what the government is doing. Okay? You can hold your representatives accountable. Because the representatives of your state government, of your national government, are elected by the people. And even though you can't vote yet, you will vote one day, or you'll have the opportunity to vote one day. Okay? You have influence with your parents, you have influence with other adults. If you show yourself as one who knows what's going on, when there's a discussion about political events, you can bring your knowledge to the fore and say, you know, I've heard about that politician. And I believe he doesn't have the best interests of our nation at heart. I don't think he's good for these reasons. And once you prove yourself that you know what you're doing, that you know what you're talking about, you can have influence with adults who are choosing, who are making decisions about the government. Okay, you can write and visit your elected officials. You can go to them and thank them for what they're doing that's right, and politely, respectfully ask them about issues where you think they may be off track. And again, there will be some who will dismiss you because you're just a boy. You're just a girl. But if you prove that you know what you're talking about, if you have that credibility, you can make an impact. You don't have to stand in the legislature. You as a private citizen. Now, I disagreed with the wording of the Constitution, where it says, we the people. I believe it should say, we the states, because the government should be formed out of the states. But it is what it is. It says, we the people of the United States. You are the people of the United States. The power of the government rests on you. Okay? If you elect godly leaders, if you elect or have a part of electing men who are concerned about the liberties of the individuals, then our nation will remain free. See, one of the things about government is it gets power to itself. It tries to appease the people. When people say, Oh, you need to stop that. I'm sorry. Then what the government tends to do is throw a few trinkets. Oh, here, we'll give you this benefit. Oh, we'll give you this. And if enough people get a little bit, then that calms them down. So they don't make as big a fuss about their liberties being taken away, because they get this little trinket instead. But you need to be discerning. You need to see beyond the little handout that the government may give you. How will this affect my life? How will this affect my children? Will my children be more free than I? Or will they become enslaved? It's up to you. Each of us, individually, is responsible for our government. All of us collectively are responsible for our government. We must fight for freedom. In my day, there were thousands of men who fought for freedom, who gave up all they had. They were away from their family and friends for years, suffering loneliness, suffering deprivation, suffering hunger and thirst and cold. There were times when their bloody footprints were in the snow or on the trail because they had inadequate shoes. But they continued because they believed in liberty. It was worth it. It was worth the deprivation. It was worth giving their lives to be free. So their children could be free. So that you could be free. So that I could be free. And when we come to the place as a people where we are no longer willing to sacrifice to be free, we will not be free. We will become slaves. It is up to us, it is up to you to assure that doesn't happen. You need to have the same heart as those men of 1776. Those men who wore shirts emblazoned with liberty or death. Because if we do not have liberty, we are dead. So I beseech you, I implore you, guard your liberty as a precious jewel. Beware of anyone who comes near it. Fight for liberty. Because without liberty, there is only death. God bless you as you fight.